Today's slideshow is the first in a series designed to help you get ready for the SOL in May. Each one should last between 8 and 12 minutes, 15 at the most, and it'll highlight some of the key concepts for the SOL from each unit. The goal is that you can pull this up at any time to do a quick review to get ready for the test, whether it be before you go to bed, on the bus on the way to school, at lunch, even during the commercials of your favorite TV show. So we'll start off by looking at the learning targets for the first unit. 1.1 is I can describe the characteristics of the Paleolithic and Neolithic era. 1.2 is I can compare and contrast the developments of the Paleolithic and Neolithic era, meaning you can take what you learned from part 1 and compare them to each other and see how they're similar or different in part 2. 1.3 is I can map the migration of early man, show where he starts, where he spreads, and why. And 1.4 is I can explain the significance of archaeology on the discovery of early man. We're actually going to start with the archaeology. So archaeology is how we learn about the past. It's the study of past societies through analyzing remains, settlements, fossils, and artifacts. Off to the side, you can see an example of a settlement on the top and some possible artifacts on the bottom. Remember, this is so necessary because we don't have any written records from this time period. So we have to rely on finding things that they used or areas that they lived to learn about what they did. In order to find out how old these artifacts are and place them on a timeline correctly, archaeologists use carbon dating to determine the age of artifacts to make sure they're in the right spot so we're looking at the development of man correctly. Archaeology is really helpful in Jurassic Park. That's how they get the dinosaurs. Obviously, that's not real, but it's a really cool movie, so I put it in the slide. Three early archaeological sites that you should be able to recognize are Jericho, Aleppo, and Catalhoyuk. Jericho and Aleppo are on the Jordan River in present-day Palestine, and Catalhoyuk is in present-day Turkey. Quite honestly, for the SOL, as long as you can identify these two as early archaeological dig sites, rather these three, you should be in pretty good shape. So where do humans emerge? If I were to say in what area do we find the earliest remains, I really hope that everyone would be able to correctly identify Africa. Hopefully you said Africa. So Homo sapiens or wise men are going to emerge in Africa. There's Africa. Remember, that's where Lucy's discovered that we talked about earlier in the year. From there, you can see where man migrates to. They migrate to Eurasia, which is a fancy way of saying Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, following sources of food. If you follow the arrows, you can track their migration. Again, notice the dates. Remember, these are BCE, so they go backwards. Or like negative numbers, as we discussed in class. So the first era of history that we take a look at is the Paleolithic Era. The Paleolithic or Old Stone Age lasts between 400,000 and 8,000 BCE. Remember, the word Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, refers to the types of tools they used. Most of the Paleolithic Era is going to take place during the Ice Age, when glaciers covered most of the Earth's surface. If you look at some of the pictures at the bottom, obviously the ones on the left and right are just for fun, but the one in the middle shows us both the way early man lived, but also the way they maybe possibly communicated through cave art, and we'll hit each of these characteristics in the following slides. So the Paleolithic Era, there are 7 major characteristics you need to remember. 7 seems like a lot, but they're pretty simplistic. The first one is what type of tools they used, and hopefully you know they used stone tools. Remember, Paleolithic means Old Stone Age. Second is how did they survive? How did they get what they needed? Okay, and hopefully you remember that there's one big thing that early man didn't know how to do, which was create their own food. So they had to go find it. So they were hunter-gatherers. Remember, normally the men hunted, the women gathered, hunting for animals and meat, gathering berries and grains and different sorts of things. Maybe the most important characteristic to remember is that early man was nomadic. What's nomadic mean? Hopefully you said something along the lines of moving from one place to another, following the sources of food, shelter, and water. You can see that in the upper picture there. Nomadic is one of the key characteristics of the Paleolithic Era, and one of the things that also makes it very different from the Neolithic Era. Fourth is they formed clans. They didn't do this hunting and gathering by themselves. That's pretty difficult, so they formed groups to make it a little bit easier. They also used caves as shelter. It wouldn't make sense to build an elaborate living structure when you just have to move on from it when the food runs out. So they used ready-made shelter in the form of caves. They also used fire. for warmth and protection. They used it to keep animals away and to keep warm at night. Remember, we're in the Ice Age. And finally, they relied on oral language for communication. We don't have written records from this time period, which is why the archaeological records are so important. But remember, they did use cave art. And hopefully, if you went back to the last slide, you could see there's evidence of hunting, gathering, clans in that picture. Our next era we take a look at is the Neolithic Era. The Neolithic Era lasts between 8,000 and 4,000 BCE, and it's when the Ice Age ends. Hopefully you remember this picture from class. I put it up at the very beginning and said, what do you see? How is it different from the Paleolithic Era? Hopefully you can see again that there are some different things in here. For instance, there's a man down here farming. Before, he wouldn't farm. He'd be out looking for food. But notice it looks like he's farming. Up here we have some caged-in animals. That relates to domestication, taming of animals. And finally, we see a structure that someone lived in that was clearly built, not a cave. This would suggest that maybe they're not as nomadic as they once were. And these are some of the key characteristics of the Neolithic Era. The biggest change in the Neolithic Era is that they learned how to farm. We call this the agricultural revolution. Remember, revolution can mean a war, but it can also just mean a big major change. So rising temperatures and improved climate led man to develop farming. It was actually by accident. Seeds were scattered from previous gathering seasons, and they grew in the plants. And after a while, man realized that if they put their seeds in the ground, they'd get plants and food as well. So really, it was just an accident that came about when the temperatures got better. Earliest form of agriculture was slash and burn. We've talked about this in class. You cut the trees down, light them on fire. That adds nutrients to the soil, plant crops, harvest, and then do it all over again. After a while, though, they needed even better ways to farm. So they developed improved tools and techniques to help societies increase the amount of crops they could grow, because you need as much food as you can get. Things like plows and irrigation ditches, which would help bring water to fields, were ways that they improved farming. So if we go back to the idea that they're no longer nomadic during this time period, because we had that teepee in that picture, or that structure in that picture, we have to solve the hunting and the gathering problem. This solves the gathering problem. You can now get plants that you couldn't get before. Now we have to solve, though, the hunting problem. And we do that through domestication of animals. Remember, domestication is the taming of goats, sheep, pigs, and cattle that began during the Neolithic Era. Taming or domestication just means you can keep them with you. You don't have to chase them around anymore, which would be key to not being nomadic. Main positive of domestication was the ability to feed people by providing things like milk, meat, fertilizer, farm labor. Notice in the bottom picture, those cattle are pulling a plow, helping the farmer. Negative, though, is it introduced diseases because of the close proximity to animals. Remember, domestication is still something we have today. Your cats and dogs, they're domesticated, or I guess bunnies like in that picture. This all in total is going to lead to the civilized world. And that's the big difference between the Paleolithic and Neolithic era. Agriculture and the domestication of animals during the Neolithic era made civilization possible and ended that nomadic lifestyle. They didn't have to move anymore. Now people began to settle into communities based around arable, good farmland, because they could grow their own food. They didn't have to chase it anymore. People also created permanent settlements, like you can see in the bottom picture. No more caves. You can stay in one spot so you can build structures. While some farmed, others could do other jobs, such as crafts or trading goods. This should sound like, hopefully, the development of early economic and social classes. And hopefully you can see that we're starting to put together what we study for the rest of the year. People are living together, producing their own food. They don't have to move. As a result, they're also going to need to develop government to have a sense of control for their civilization. They're going to have to create economics to get all the things they need in addition to food. That's going to create social classes, and you put all those things together and you create a culture for your civilization. And these are all things we're going to cover in the following presentations. The last thing for this first unit is to remember the earliest example of a Neolithic settlement, which is Stonehenge. So Stonehenge was believed to have been built around 2500 BCE. Its building was today England. An example of a Neolithic settlement. You could tell it's Neolithic because why would anyone build those structures and then just move away from them? Obviously, these were built when people stayed near Stonehenge, so it had to be during the Neolithic era. And remember, people have some crazy theories about Stonehenge, but for the SOL, just know it's a Neolithic settlement in present day England.